Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about diversions, D10s, and decision to decrement, increment, decrement, move down by a notch. Okay, I think I know where you're going with that. The author decided to put off the next damage installment for some housekeeping, more specifically addressing the black sheep of the weapon family, D10 die. D12s are rarely used across 5th edition and the Mathfinder, perhaps only known for being the Barbarian's hit die, max HP gain on level up, and the divisive Grade X damage die. EyePatchNotes does not relish the variability of D12s, and by extension D10s, as the end result can be indistinguishable from an inferior die. A D10 can roll an 8, and below, just as a D8, D8s themselves capable of 6 and below. It is this Parley's thesis, then, that Mathfinder uses D10s as a punishment or thoughtful balance measure when 2d6 is too much and 1d8 is too low. I also want to read a little summary you wrote as well, because there's a certain thing we need to untangle, and some of you might be thinking, why are we so upset about all these die? This Parley suffered many rewrites. I did want to address some of the speed bumps in prior months, EyePatchNotes says, and I'm still tuning the exact pace I want to go over Pathfinder's at times Byzantine rulings. For the summary this time, D10s and D12s are only as superior as their ability to roll above a 6. Reach weapons are desirable for multi-attacks and therefore punished by inconsistent die. We'll get to that later. Size manipulation is only mandatory for certain classes and animals, so most damage profiles are static. I will get to that later, I think. 1d8 to 2d6 is the primary jump that is worth it, and I will never understand why that is one of the jumps on the... But yes, it's a very big, significant jump. 1d12 grows into 3d6, fixing the inconsistency of a single die. That, what? Okay, anyway. For added mega clarity, EyePatchNotes not liking D10s and D12s is a biased observation and not an academic statement. As is hopefully portrayed in this filler episode, D10s do have a place in Mathfinder as a detriment to a weapon. Once a weapon is on the D10 track, it will only bloom into 2d8, 3d8, and beyond. The same gripes with D6s versus D8s apply. D8s are only dire improvements if they cement themselves above D6s. Statistically unlikely, 2d10 is also not an expected damage profile. This is maybe confusing to some people, but I think the sentiment is pretty straightforward. You're basically suggesting that Pathfinder uses dice inconsistency as a balancing mechanic, either intentionally or like it is a balancing mechanic, even if that isn't why it was made that way. I admit that because of the there's sort of a few things. The benefit of the consistency is kind of subjective. I completely agree. I accept that while you say D10s and D12s being bad is a biased observation and not an academic statement, it's kind of an academic statement. I mean, they are less consistent, and 2d6 is more consistent. Like, that it is real that is more consistent. At the same time, there is a degree to which there's like a question about practicality. If an enemy has a gigantic amount of health, it doesn't really matter if the damage you're doing is consistent. If you hit them like 50 times, it's going to end up averaging out. But you don't though. I mean, I don't know your life. I don't know what your Pathfinder games are like, but people hit few enough times, I would argue, in most 5th edition and Mathfinder adjacent combat that it does matter if the weapon is consistent, because it can be difficult to make a decision about whether to attack something if it feels like, well, it's very possible that it will die, but I'm well capable of rolling a 1 and then the attack did little. We're going to talk about that in a few ways in this parlay. But it's not like that isn't a problem. It is quite difficult to discuss this subject. I will freely admit that these have been extremely challenging parlay because it is almost impossible on the spot to keep all of the numbers of the die straight. The way the dice chain grows doesn't really make sense, in my opinion. And it's not your fault, EyePatchNotes. It just doesn't make sense, in my humble opinion. There are some jumps that I feel like are just a bit arbitrary, though you do talk about that in this parlay, which I found interesting. It just doesn't make the way it's designed really make sense, in my opinion. There's just an interesting consequence to it that we're going to discuss. And then there's just all sorts of weird ways the progression works. 1d12 growing into 3d8 like sort of does make sense, but it mostly makes me slowly lose my sanity. Like, what is happening? And of course, because the probabilities are not only changing in subtle ways, right? Like 1d12 growing into 3d6. Well, that's 18. 12 grew to 18. That, like, I guess sort of makes sense. But it also grew from 1 to 12 to 3 to 18. A more difficult to appreciate nuance. I mean, it's consistency. And of course, now that it's 3d6, you're going to roll the average much more often, like 1d8 to 2d6. It's now very likely you'll roll a 7 versus equally likely to get every result with the d8. Of course, and so there isn't an easy way to, even if I was very comfortable with the mental math, which I'm only moderately comfortable with, there just isn't an easy way to quantify all of those things. So this has been a very challenging subject to talk about. Byzantine is damn right for these rules, right? And I'm sure it was hard for you to write. You said this parlay suffered too many rewrites. This is the 4th take starting this video. This is the first time I got past 5 minutes. So we'll see how this goes. We can talk about it more later, but I want to finish reading the little intro bit before we get to the chunk of the parlay. EyePatchNotes quickly notes that we dropped the table from this parlay, though it can be simplified to 2 tracks. There's an A track, 1d4, 1d6, 1d8, 2d6, 3d6, etc. And then a B track, 1d10, 2d8, 3d8, 4d8, etc. 1d12 is considered 2d6 by the system, so it grows to 3d6. 2d4 would be considered 1d8 and grows to 2d6. Okay, that sort of makes more sense. I just got finished saying this makes no sense to me, and actually that makes significantly more sense now that I'm reading it aloud here. Maybe I was overreacting about how confused that was, but it is noteworthy for this parlay that basically if the weapon starts with 1d10, it kind of gets permanently punished by not getting on the normal dice track that will give it a bunch of d6s, but instead gets put on a different dice track that gives it a bunch of d8s as its damage increases. Again, there may be people who haven't been watching this series who are saying, how the heck is the damage going to increase? So, like, when do you use this? And we will be talking about that at great length, but when you increase your size, when you get a stronger weapon, maybe we'll be getting into it a little. There's this way in which you can kind of punish a weapon with inconsistency in the game's design, though I think there's a significant question about why from a game design perspective. You know, I don't, that doesn't sound like a good idea to me eyeballing it, so let's explore. I feel like that it would be extremely good. It's kind of amazing until proven, you know, guilty, to just remove there being a second dice chain. So if you could, I mean, there better be some big benefits to including it, is how I feel from a game design perspective. Anyway, while Pathfinder sort of has too many weapons, yeah, there's a traceable pattern. Keen Edge is the primary crit boosting spell, doubling the crit rate of slashing and piercing weapons. Pathfinder says the player can increase weapons crit once, so a weapon's final crit rate can only be 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, or 30%. Damage types are a topic for a wholly different time, but note that bludgeoning weapons are not eligible for Keen Edge. Typically, only true swords and blades get the highest base crit rate of 15%. So on an 18, 19, or 20 on the d20, they roll a crit. Hammers, spears, and axes tend to fall into high crit multiplier but low base crit rate due to some of the alluded to factors discussed in the main parlay and here in the sidebar. Bludgeoning left out by systemic crit support, so a high crit multiplier makes them feel slightly stronger. Spears reach weapons, so they lose out on pure crit rate and damage compared to swords. Axes, gotta make them feel different, so they have high base damage, high crit multiplier, but less crit rate. Also found this strangely relevant card art from Yu-Gi-Oh! That shows possible evolutions from a great sword. Might be thumbnail material, depends on how it looks when cropped. Been clean for years, not playing at all, I can quit anytime I want. I will use it as the thumbnail, so the image you thought as the thumbnail, you all saw as the thumbnail for this video is that. It just looks ridiculous. It's like, I mean, just go look at the thumbnail, but at the same time, There's so many different versions of like an evolution. What is this from Yu-Gi-Oh? Anyway, the swords are evolving into other swords that are different in the amount of edge they have. The amount that I'm cringing when I look at them. I don't know. That's wild. This is meant to provide any sort of meaningful decision to the player is absolute insanity, in my opinion. But I don't know the context, so maybe it somehow does. Um, yeah, okay, so here we can kind of do two forks, but the topic of the parlay is set. It's that there is this kind of weirdness where having two different die tracks allows Mathfinder, I'm just saying it that instead of, it's not even a joke anymore, that's just what it's called, it can use to balance weapons out. And again, while you, it's nice of you to say, EyePatchNotes, that it is, you know, you dislike D10s and D12s maybe more than there is like an objective reason to. That's one, completely fine. I mean, sure, why not? Fair enough. And two, it's not like there is no reason to dislike them, for sure. I was thinking about when you play Baldur's Gate 3, this interesting thing happens where if you've played Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, much of the damage is the same. By contract, I believe they had to keep, you know, a good amount of the stuff the same and implement 5th edition in, you know, Baldur's Gate 3. So when you cast some spells, if you've played a lot of both games, you've cast a spell that does, say, 3d8 a good amount of times. And it sounds fairly substantial. I mean, especially for a first level, what is that, chromatic orb or something? It sounds fairly substantial. That's just what I wrote as an example. And I had been thinking of that as a beefy amount of damage. But in Baldur's Gate 3, it shows the damage range instead of the number of die by default, and then the number of die is in parentheses. So 3d8 on that spell reads in the game as 3 to 24, which feels like it really highlights that feeling like I could do only 3 damage if I cast this spell, and it feels, you know, pretty bad. There have been spells that seem to do a colossal amount of damage in tabletop. You know, it's a 4th level spell that does 4d10 damage, and you go 4d10 seems huge, but then when the spell reads out, it's like it could do 4 damage. 4 damage, folks. And it feels weirdly worse having that highlighted. In fact, of course, this is an abstraction, and EyePatchNotes is simply thinking about that all of the time, is what it seems like, which you well should. I mean, that's the damage it does, right? You're not like gonna do 4 damage almost all of the time, as you freely admit in these parlay. You know, it's not like likely you will actually roll the minimum, of course, but being able to roll the minimum is a lot. And it does beg the question, you know, is using die for damage for spells really a good idea? Really the topic of this parlay? No, is the answer to both of those questions. Because you can only make a spell's damage more consistent by adding a ton of dice, which is inconvenient fun, but kind of inconvenient to roll. Thus, you can make a spell convenient to roll, but very inconsistent in a way that can be unsatisfying, or inconvenient to roll, but I guess consistent in the weirdest way possible. We're not really going to talk about it too much in this parlay, but it's also worth noting, especially if you're not familiar with these games, that when you hit with your weapon or whatever, you generally add your stat modifier as well. So for example, when you're hitting with this D12 Great Axe, it sounds very inconsistent. You can do 1 to 12 damage, but you're probably going to add your modifier for strength or whatever, so it will be like 1 to 12 plus 4, for example. So 5 to, 16, these games do have some kind of solution. It just occurred to me that I don't really know. We may have come up in these parlay or not. I cannot remember whether Pathfinder actually does that. 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons does do that, which, to be fair, is a reasonable solution for this problem. You can add significant consistency by adding your modifier. Then again, spells don't do it. So I think we can see where my stake in this parlay is. No, let's keep going. But I wanted to establish a little bit that the idea that there would be like an inconsistency punishment as a game balancing thing, totally a thing as far as I'm concerned. Adding an entire second dice chain to achieve that seems very bad, but I mean, let's take a look. I don't know. As EyePatchNotes says, a whirlwind introduction of the topic, Mathfinder has two kinds of size increases, physical and virtual. Enlarge person physically increases the size of the target and their gear, moving their weapon dice forward one step. There's a spell called Lead Blades, which is virtual, or you're making up a term for this other kind of like size category increase, treating the weapon as one size larger without altering its physical properties. Interesting, okay? So there's an enchantment type of spell that is just you move up the dice chain one. Things go right into the weeds when there is a systemic limit on how many size increases a creature can benefit from. Enlarged person cannot stack with other effects that alter the body, primarily the druid-like wild shape and other shape-changing abilities. In my mind, this is a sanity measure, so players can't go trigger happy with every size change in the books. Virtual size increases echo this non-stacking clause, only one effect can apply. However, physical and virtual size increases can stack with each other. A character can grow from medium to large and still wield a weapon affected by lead blades, moving up the dice chain twice, such as 1d12 moving to 3d6 and then moving to 4d6 for a medium character who starts with a medium great axe. Mathfinder does have avenues for 4 valid size increases, or even 6, with mounting levels of nicheness that seem to have been omitted here, which you could decide for yourself whether going down the rabbit hole or preserving our sanity would have been better. Because size manipulation is functionally a core mechanic, size builds are a valid and popular destination for the martial-minded Pathfinder community. It should be noted that downsized reach weapons do not have an official ruling. A small two-handed weapon with reach is technically a one-handed reach weapon for a medium user at -2 accuracy. Game masters are on their own for ruling whether the user still enjoys one extra tile of melee range. My near absolute answer is no, because one-handed reach is very expensive in terms of power budget and deliberately gated behind exotic proficiency and small damage die. Pulling from the canonical written weapon tables, a medium one-handed whip is 1d3 damage. Oof. But deserved, because it has reach. Yet another landmine for another time, caster and spell damage has much higher ceilings for much less work compared to martial damage. D&D's classic Fireball deals d6s equal to the caster's level in Pathfinder context. Pathfinder's initial cap of 10d6 can be increased or even removed with feats. And in typical Pathfinder horror, a caster feat can result in damage increases measured in whole dice rather than flat amounts. Yes, and this is something that I wrote in my notes for the end of the parlay, but I'll touch on now. I don't fully understand why this is done from a balancing perspective. Even if you just look at 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, Fireball doing 8d6 is amazing in response to all of this inconsistency we talked about. 8d6 is pretty consistent. I mean, you get a lot of die to spread out. Like, it's a lot of damage over a large area. And if they save, they pass the saving throw, they still take half damage. But on top of all of that, that would all be enough. On top of all of that, the damage you're going to get is pretty reliable. You get a lot of die. It's probably going to be about the same average, which I do not know off the top of my head. And it goes from there. So yeah, I while it sounds like it's a different mechanical situation in Pathfinder, the weirdness of the design remains, and I do want to talk about that at the end if we have time. So, okay, the stage is set. You can increase your size category by a whole bunch of times, and so the idea that there would be like a second dice chain that lets you kind of wonk up the way that people progress their damage as they upgrade it with Enlarged Person or Lead Blades or whatever. There's a weirdness there. So why use this? I mean, how is the balance being used? As you say, there's this odd thing where reach is really strong, and we'll talk about why in a minute. And so having a weapon be able to achieve reach but be shrunk so that it can fit in one hand seems kind of overpowered. Like, they nerfed that heavily with whips being probably the only reach weapon that is one-handed. It is in 5th edition. And so the damage is really bad. And so if you shrink a weapon with a lot of damage so it can fit in one hand and it has reach, I mean, the damage will be worse, but it's probably not 1d3, which ends up being fairly overpowered. You could argue that, well, those are the shenanigans that the game is letting you get up to, but we need to look at the opportunity cost. I mean, is it an interesting design decision or just overpowered always to allow the player to do that? I mean, we're not going to specifically look at that exact example here, but just that is the type of thing we're going to talk about. Looking at a few, there's an asterisk and it says, "We are still in the Witch of Contradiction series. The author swears this parlay is topical." Okay, sure. Select weapons. 1d10 is often selected when a combination of traits makes 2d6 excessive. The qualities that eat up a lot of power budget are crit chance and reach. As a recap and oversimplification, Mathfinder disables a character's ability to multi-attack if they move during their turn. Reach weapons, then, are desirable for their ability to permit multi-attacks, where shorter weapons could only strike once. Like, if an enemy walks 10 feet out of your range, you can't just move a little bit and then multi-attack. You would have to move a little bit, and that tiny bit of movement forfeits you your extra attacks. So a reach weapon may be able to save the multi-attacks where others wouldn't. Pretty powerful. You could get a whole additional extra attack. Note how expensive crit chance and reach are in terms of power budget, table time, ambush table. Let's be there. So weapons like the Elven Curve Blade, two-handed finesse, two-handed and scaling with dexterity. Ooh, how lavish. And the Fauchard, high crit and reach, are gated behind feats or feat equivalent abilities. They're exotic weapons, which you've mentioned in previous parlay require some qualifications to be able to use. Speaking of feats, the system does not actually expect the player to engage with dice size progression that much. The previously discussed monks and animal companions, there's that asterisk again, are the primary demographic, with other martials only if players opt into shenanigans. Weapon proficiency, typically gained through a feat, effectively alters the character's damage dice while maintaining or gaining desirable traits. Even if Mathfinder has many feat opportunities, the player still pays a palpable cost to nudge their damage dice forward just a bit. Let's take a look at the table a little bit more. So you can see the purpose of this is to illustrate that we have opportunity cost coming from removing various qualities from a weapon. So if you start at a medium greatsword, and that has 2d6 damage, crits on a 19 or 20, and has a 2x critical multiplier, you can see something like the Bardiche. The damage goes down, it's 1d10, but it gains reach. And so you sacrifice 2d6, 1d10, but it can hit from further away. Now the difference begins to show itself a little bit, though, when you can see that because it's 1d10, it's now locked to that weaker dice track. The medium greatsword, when it becomes large, is now 2d6 to 3d6. The Bardiche is on the 1d10 track, and so it goes 2d8 instead. It not only has less dice, which is less reliable, it also is starting on the back foot. You know, where 3d6 versus 2d8 is similar damage, 16 to 18, you know, as the maximum damage. But the greatsword is way more consistent, significantly more consistent, both before and after the size increase. And that's never going to become untrue. The relative inconsistency is saddled with the Bardiche forever. I admit after 2 or 3 die, it feels like not as big of a deal to me, but I mean, it's certainly worse as far as consistency. I see why that would bother someone. And then we have the exotic examples. They get various demerits. They do less damage. They're on the D10 track, and they're exotic. You need to acquire them either by being a very specific class, it sounds like, maybe could use them by default, and maybe that class wouldn't want to use them by default too much or wouldn't be that excited about a martial weapon like this. Or you could take a feat to be able to use them, but they have various benefits. Crit up, a two-handed finesse weapon, disgusting. And then a reach and high crit weapon, 18, 19, and 20 for crits. And reach, that's pretty spicy, though it has less die to go with it. The end of it is also full of glorious further examples. We have weapons that crit less often and go on the D10 track, but gain reach, like the glaive. Pretty similar example to the Bardiche. In fact, what is the advantage of the glaive? It looks like it crits less often, but is otherwise the same as the Bardiche. Anyway, I don't know. Medium great axe, you can see what has 1d12. So compared to 2d6, it's the same-ish. 2d6 is a tiny bit higher because you can't roll a 1. Damage range, but the damage is more random. I think a totally arguably meaningful downgrade. And then you can see it will upgrade to 3d6. It's still on the good track, so it's going to get that consistency back, while one size increase makes the Great Axe way more consistent. But it's got a 3x crit multiplier. The Nodachi has the honorable, highly Bushido warrior path honorable distinction of you becoming a weeb, and you also go on the 1d10 track, a lesser, demerit, but it has better crits, 18 to 20 crit range. The Lucerne Hammer, how bespoke, crit and damage down, or it has the inconsistency thing, and it only has crits on a 20, but it gains reach. So yeah, we have a variety of examples of the ways that you're going to pay an opportunity cost to, get various benefits. A lot of the time, you can see, objectively, there are plenty of examples of the game putting you on the 1d10 track as a way to kind of balance out a weapon. Now, looking at this chart, I personally don't entirely understand, in some cases, like why it's one weapon over another. You see what I mean? So looking at the Great Axe, for example, it seems really good that it gets to be on the d6 track as it increases in size. Or like the Lucerne Hammer, you could say, well, the reason that this matters at all, it doesn't have a huge amount of benefits to my eye, but it doesn't have to be on the d8 track. It's on the d6 track, so it gets more die, it's more consistent. That seems maybe significant. But for a lot of them, so you can see in the middle, there's a whole bunch of weapons that it feels like deserve the d8, demerit. Or I don't know about deserve, but I mean that it seems to be being used for balance, right? The Fauchard, and the Elven Curveblade have a bunch of really uniquely powerful qualities, and so there's a balancing tool available, which is to put them on a less powerful dice progression track. And there it's being used. But things like the Bardiche and the Nodachi, I feel less convinced there's a reason those also warrant that drawback. And then the Great Axe and the Lucerne Hammer, the Great Axe in particular, it doesn't fully feel like that is earned, like being on the good track. You know what I mean? Like it seems like pretty fine, and then has the bigger crit multiplier. It's basically just a better greatsword with more randomness, only if you do absolutely nothing to improve it. And then if you do improve it a little bit, it immediately loses that drawback and now has the big old crit multiplier. Though it has less of a crit range, of course. But still, I mean, that's significant. So I don't know. I mean, this is only some of the examples. You're not just going to show us every single weapon. But it's interesting as a place to start the discussion. Like it's weird to me. I feel like some of these, it doesn't entirely feel like they actually are using it as a the 1d10 and then d8's dice chain as a balancing tool, as much as that is the knob available to turn. And you kind of reference this as well. To me, there's a kind of design. I would love to hear from the designers. Did you do this because you think the 1d10 track is really a lot worse, or just because that is the way that you can put the weapon down a little notch when it feels appropriate to do so? Or a combination of both, I guess. It seems like a clumsy system. I mean, I think the idea that there need to be two separate dice chains is really just breaking my brain a little bit. I would almost rather it be that the weapon goes back to the normal single dice chain after a few jumps, or that one of the initial jumps is just weaker or stronger. For example, a 1d10 weapon compared to a 1d12 weapon. Well, the 1d10 weapon is going to go to 2d8. The 1d12 weapon is going to go to 2d6, 3d6. And so to me, it feels like surely the 1d10 weapon can be just treated as 1d12 or 2d6 to get it back on track. And then that first size increase is just a little bit more powerful. or you could do it somewhere down the line. You know, they kind of meet back up eventually. Surely once you've done 3 or 4 size increases, it would be okay to just make them be the same. You see what I mean? I feel like there is a way to reduce the complexity with that system, but having there be knobs to turn for balancing, it makes some sense. Like, that's not nonsensical to do. Let's finish reading the Parley prompt, and then I have a few more things to say. Given that there is a certain magical index where that's I understood that reference, where weapon damage jumps from 1d8 to 2d6, one conclusion to draw is that there is a certain threshold before size manipulation becomes relevant. Last Parley mentioned a huge dagger striking for 1d8 with -4 accuracy. The base die being 1d4 prevents the dagger from cresting 2d6. Excuse me. Ugh. I just need air from this Parley. I couldn't be more awake because I want to figure out a way to remove that other dice chain. So please excuse me. There's just a lot to read. It prevents the dagger from cresting 2d6 because it's base 1d4 without yet another size increase. It's possible for the player to accept an enlarged person or similar buff to get there, but the player has now paid 3 costs just to get the dagger to have good base damage. I think that part of what you're trying to evoke here is that having the base material for all of these size increases be it doesn't make sense. There's something systematically where, you know, well, you get the accuracy demerit, but it makes sense to start with a good material to increase by all these size degrees. And there's stuff like crits and stuff that won't change as easily too. Dancing around crits one more time, saying that a Great Axe is 1d12, crits for 3d12 is not quite accurate. Is it not? Is that not how that works? The multiplier takes place after the die is rolled, meaning that a whiff of 3, 6, or 9 damage with 5% crit chance is entirely likely. Oh, I understand. You're just trying to point out that you don't roll 3d12. You roll 1d12 and then triple it. So the thing about the difference is it's less consistent. It retains the lack of consistency. That's totally meaningful, yes. I must have just gotten overwhelmed and didn't highlight that. I completely agree and didn't mean to not imply that doesn't matter. By the captain's own admission in a previous Parley, reference made non-maliciously, yeah, no, it's not, a hypothetical damage profile of 4 to 40 feels bad. It does. I wrote in the thing about Baldur's Gate 3 and damage ranges before I read this part of the Parley on my first pass when I was making notes about the beginning part. And then I scrolled down to here and found, yes, I completely agree. Especially seeing the range, but also once you start thinking about this, I can never go back, you know, cannot unsee. The 4 to 40 is just messed up. You will start to become very troubled about damage ranges. And personally, I think when I play 5th edition and derivative materials D&D in the future, I'm going to be implementing some kind of system by which you do a higher floor amount of damage. You do something like also your spellcasting modifier to all spell damage, and then I remove some of the randomness, because I just don't see a design merit to the range of damage being so large. Having it be that you have to adapt to something being meaningfully less effective is good, but having your spell do 10 times the expected damage is not interesting to me. Like, that is beyond just a little bit of randomness that the player adapts to. That's like, you can do an entire combat worth of damage in one action, or lose an entire combat worth of damage in one action. That just doesn't make sense, in my opinion. So yeah, I will be changing this. If nothing else, after this Parley, Baldur's Gate 3 kind of scarred me about this subject. So absolutely, no, it does feel bad, or it's just not sensible design, in my opinion. It's a way to do it with die, and that's it. A small solace, or should we say a large solace, is that growing the Great Axe results in a base damage of 3d6. This is what I was celebrating before. You get the consistency really quick if you size it up. If the medium Great Axe crits for 3 to 36, a large Great Axe crits for 9 to 54, while still a huge range, a lot more consistent on the low end. Exact statistics aside, a 3d6 weapon is also unlikely to actually roll a 3, right? For parting thoughts, Enlarge Person is actually a first level spell in Pathfinder, making for very economical potion and spell slot use. There's a sister spell, Lead Blades, that we talked about that gives the weapon a virtual size increase, moving it to the next damage bracket without physically increasing its size. Pathfinder's Shillelagh also functions this way for druids, like a virtual size increase, okay? Though it is a cumbersome first level slot and an action, totally unviable. What? Rather than 5th edition's cantrip and bonus action. Just to say, there are quite a few class and subclass abilities that all allow the player to read, weigh, and engage in the surprisingly nuanced size system. There's certainly a lot of text in the size system. I would agree that with nuanced in that there are a lot of interesting design knobs to turn, but I still feel like there's complexity here that could be reduced without making it any less fun to use. The idea that there are weapons worth trimming down, to me, is a key place. I also look at systems like crits, and it makes me think I see a benefit to having weapons that are more critty. Some players might like that kind of thing, but in Baldur's Gate 3, I'll use as a parallel example, they did something kind of interesting where a lot of the gear that you can acquire will increase your critical range by 1. So things only crit on a 20 in 5th edition by default. And there's a lot of gear, quite a bit, maybe in the area of 10. Maybe it's a little less than that, but something like 10 or so, maybe a little less pieces of gear in the game, mostly in different slots, or you can equip almost all of it at the same time in theory, right? That will increase the number you need to roll a crit will go down by 1. So you adjust the 20, you equip one of these, it's 19 to 20, you equip 2, it's 18 to 19, 20. And there is also 1 or 2 class features of feats that will, under some circumstances, decrease your crit range. You can build into crits with quite a lot of different systems in 5th edition in Baldur's Gate 3 using 5th edition's framework, but it doesn't have anything to do with the weapon in terms of how likely you are to crit. The weapons still have different die. This whole consistency thing still exists as per se. But there aren't really easy ways to grow the weapon's damage die and thus increase your crit's damage a lot. You can just make it more consistent. The interesting thing is that in Pathfinder, it sounds like many of the times that the weapon is going to have big crits, it's at the cost of the weapon's damage on that crit being consistent. The Great Axe, for example. It might do huge crit damage, but it's punished with inconsistency. Baldur's Gate 3 took the, I think, very elegant route of making it so the way you make crits better is by making them happen more often, and that's essentially it. And that increases the damage. I mean, it makes them happen more often. And also, of course, it's an auto hit, so you are increasing your accuracy by quite a bit as well. Quite a bit, potentially. You can throw your chance to hit in the garbage if you have a ton of crit chance. And if you get advantage and roll twice, I have obviously, by this discussion, you can now tell, built a character who is extremely consistent, basically never misses any target no matter what their armor class is, and crits, the vast majority of the time, let's say, without really building into their offensive stat very much, because it no longer has much benefit. And I like that way of doing it because it makes it consistent. It means anyone can crit. It's an exciting part of the system that exists for everyone, but it's much more meaningful, much more consistent, and much more of an asset that you can use tactically if you build into it. To me, that is kind of the appealing approach here. Now, there is something interesting happening, though, with Pathfinder's design in this case. There's something we talked about a little bit where there are jumps that feel more meaningful. Like right at the beginning of the parlay, you said that thing about 1d8 to 2d6 being like the primary jump that feels worth it. And from a mathematic perspective, it can feel like that's true in a very simple way. It just is like a big jump. You kind of jump 2 die sizes, but also it gives you consistency. It's the point at which your 1d8, which was about to become pretty inconsistent, becomes, more consistent, quite a bit more consistent. And then that consistency never really goes away. So there's this interesting thing happening where the system of increasing your weapon size or decreasing your weapon size is kind of unrewarding until you pass a threshold, and then it becomes potentially pretty rewarding. That's fascinating from a design perspective to me. The idea that once you've done a few size increases, I thought you said this. Was this just me writing in my notes? I feel like you gave me this idea, so I don't want to take all credit here. The idea that there is a kind of threshold where if you size increase a few times, it's then that it becomes really meaningful, that the size increases you start to feel those. That's interesting from a design perspective. There's kind of three things that come to mind. It discourages splashing. That is, if the player is going to put a little bit of the size increase thing in their build, it arguably doesn't do too much a good amount of the time, unless the jump happens to be from 1d8 to 2d6. I didn't realize that when I wrote that in my notes. That's kind of ugly. But, let's say the weapon is a d6. Increasing its size category by 1 to a d8 may not be worth the opportunity cost to do so. It hasn't really hit its stride as a benefit, where you're getting from 1d8 to 2d6, and then you get a ton of consistency, and the damage increases pretty substantially. Because they're kind of trying to make it be that your damage increases by like 50%-ish a few times around the middle of the dice chain progression, to massively oversimplify the math, because I'm distracted to do it right now. There's this feeling like, yeah, the meat is if you go further with the system most of the time, meaning players hopefully won't get distracted by half-assing, if you will, a way of making a build that they're not really going to fully commit to the point that it will get good. Hopefully it will just seem underwhelming to go from 1d6 to 1d8. And it is, probably. And yet, if you go further, then there is still some reward. It's not bad, it's just only a little bit is kind of bad. That might be less distracting for players that would have just given it a shot. They'll think, oh, I would do a whole build around that. In my experience, players are very prone to this kind of thinking. People tend to think this is a crit build, so I'm going to put all the crit stuff on, and it's going to be good because it's all the crit stuff. Theme type or typal builds, that is a very, very common instinct for a lot of people, which is kind of too bad in a way, because they are not good in most games. For a very simple reason, which is that mathematically, once you have a little bit of the thing, it's just not as good to add more of it. You've added both the best source in the game of that thing, a little bit of crit, hopefully you picked a really good source of a little bit of crit, and also you have more of it already, and so even more of it is often relatively less valuable, and whatever you are doing to get a little bit more of it is probably also less valuable. It's just like a weaker piece that you're adding to get more of it. Therefore, in many games, across a lot of games, it's a trend in making builds generally that these types of theme or typal builds that I find players tend to gravitate toward are reliably bad. They're not terrible, but they're usually not very good, which I think is, in theory, kind of bad design, in that we know for sure people want to make them. If you make a game, players are going to want to make that type of build. So why design the game in a way where it will be bad? But the problem is that it's kind of a fundament of math that makes it bad. It's not exactly the game design itself. It's more like if the game doesn't go out of its way to make it good, it is by default bad, basically. Pathfinder, then, is arguably kind of responding to this. There's a way in which designing it this way means you kind of only get the main benefit if you commit to it a little bit, which players will tend to do, in my experience. And so maybe that's not so bad. Thing number 2, it kind of discourages splashing or making like a good stuff build. I consider this to be a good thing. It prevents the player from just knowing everything about the system, grabbing all of the best relative value pieces, putting them in a pile, and then figuring out what piece of class design benefits from all of those things all at once, and making a build that is a super Terminator that is relatively good at everything and makes it pointless for different decisions to exist. I don't think that it's bad to be interested in doing this. I think we can agree that there's not much merit to a system if you can trivialize all of it all at once by making a build like this. And I'll tell you that I've played a lot of games where I feel like you can do that. You can kind of just throw the system in the garbage by grabbing all of the good stuff all in one place. And there's not enough opportunity cost to doing that, or there aren't enough places where going further with that thing would let you capitalize on the benefit you got. Personally, I think that 5th edition Baldur's Gate 3 is a very positive counterexample of this. There's very good opportunity cost, and there are enough things that once you have extra attack, you kind of want more actions, or you want to be able to stay in range for extra attack, or buff the damage of each additional attack. There's enough carrots to focus on what you're doing rather than just also doing everything else. It becomes much less efficient once you have extra attack to spend your action doing things other than attacking. If you can also cast Fireball, it's just not that good because you could attack twice with that action. Well, it's still pretty good, but you get the point. And I think that's very healthy. It means that there's actual merit to, building different styles of play. If there are all these decisions and they're just there so you can play in different ways, it's pretty stupid if there isn't actually a good reason to play all these different ways, provided that you just carefully select all of the good stuff. And making the system a little bit weaker, making size increases, kind of not that good if you only do a few, but then beneficial if you do a good number of them all at once. To me, if that is actually how it feels, EyePatchNotes, when you play Pathfinder, to me seems like a good thing, all things considered. However, I think there is a potential drawback, which is that it does encourage more singular builds. Although it will encourage a lack of good stuffy builds, and encourage players to kind of focus and make a type or theme build that I think people tend to enjoy, it does also have the more minor, I think, drawback that there may be few builds that actually do benefit from the relatively high opportunity cost it might require to increase your weapon size category enough times for that to be actually good. You see what I mean? It means that while it probably isn't good all the time, and is good when you do a lot of it, there might not be that many builds that use that system. That is, you'll create a lot of game design, but it isn't actually good on that many of the total builds. The number of things the player has to learn is very high, and the number of times those things are relevant is rather low in such a system. I'm not entirely sure what to do about that, but it is something that struck me as noteworthy. This was a weirdly balanced parlay because it was very long and all of it is quite relevant. I don't think we can really skip over any of it. So I decided to basically just read the whole thing and then read most of what I had to say all at once. And that was it. It took a while because there was a lot of content, but I hope you felt like I covered it in a way that was interesting and fulfilling. It was difficult to have enough breath for, but I hope that me yawning does not in any way betray my significant interest in this subject. I personally feel like these games are fascinating examples of where you kind of don't, it sort of feels like you don't need much game design in a way, which is that if you make something fair to your player, then it's kind of all good. But as we said a long time ago, I had always kind of underestimated tabletop role-playing games as being uninteresting to make builds in because it was like there were no concrete rules. Au contraire, there are all of the concrete rules, which has come back around to being a bad thing in some cases. While having rules that mean we can reliably build something, and then the game master adjudicates and makes for like an interesting and fun balanced experience while you make your fun and powerful build, it can go too far. And here is where I have been prickling at the idea that there is really a need for all of this design just to make there be interesting weapon choices. Dungeons and Dragons is often criticized as having too few weapon choices, and I guess it's just that to me it feels like they're meant to be abstracted, or there's like a thing where surely can't the player that is bothered by having a samurai class in their game just rule it as being something different if it doesn't fit that setting? Or by comparison, if you want to use a katana but it's not in the 5th edition rules, just like use a longsword and rule it, just say it's a katana. Like, I'm not convinced that it's valuable enough for it to like need to be codified as literally doing something different when I think we can agree that in the grand scheme of killing people with a weapon, a katana really isn't that different than like a longsword. It is different in some ways, but are they subtle enough that the system, or not subtle enough that the system is going to represent them well? I don't think so. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. In some ways, I feel like D&D went the lighter approach, and Pathfinder has taken the more mathy approach, hence the nickname Mathfinder. What do we think about that? I don't know. I'm gonna think about that.